Good morning and welcome to Community Security Initiatives Consultants Corner, featuring Dov Horowitz and Ilya Yamansky. Today, our episode is Introduction to Project Management and Bidding Requirements. There's a lot to go over. So without further ado, I turn it over to Dov.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you and welcome back. We're going to continue in our Consultants Corner series. We posted a quick acknowledgement. There's no legal attachment behind this, but we just want to make sure that everyone is aware, especially those of you newer to these grants, that there are some stops. There are some things you are required to do, as we've talked about in previous sessions, that you must complete before you move forward. You know, I know a lot of people were looking forward to our advertisement session, but just let's make sure we all know that, and we'll obviously reiterate this point many times today, that the things you are required to do, such as have your contract executed, and as well as if you have an NSGP, you must have your EHP approved, not just submitted. So now you're kind of in a waiting pattern. That doesn't mean there's not things to do. We'll talk about some of those things today, what you can do as you kind of wait for that approval. But in general, you can't get forward into the next steps until these pieces are done. We'll keep reiterating that. It's an important point. So as always, you know, let's just recognize us at CSI as part of the JCRC of New York. We're providing our best guidance, our best details, help fill in the blanks from the state's information they provided. Obviously, that is your go-to resource, your contract, and the information provided in DHSES webinars. DCJS, which, you know, Division of Criminal Justice Services, as discussed on previous sessions, right there administering the more recent hate crimes grants. A little less information, come up with some other questions. If you're still struggling in that process, please see our earlier sessions. This year, we're not doing the big recaps like we did in last year's sessions, but the first step is obviously be familiar with the information those agencies have provided you. And we want to kind of fill in the gaps, help you as you move forward and all those other questions that come along and kind of make it real, and also help with the actual security guidance. But remember, you know, make sure you know the information you need to know, do your research, do your homework, but also, you know, reach out to us, reach out to your reps for your questions. So for those of you who have been with us throughout the first few sessions, remember, this is a build-up type program, right? So the first week we talked about executing your contract, right? Whether it was your NSGP or your hate crimes grant. The slide we're looking at right now, and we will look at a hate crimes flow chart, that's what we're calling this. The flow chart we're looking at right now is for your NSGP, right? So it's going to be a little bit different if you have the hate crimes grant. But also recognize, we always say this, these are phases that we have designed. If you go back to your rep at an agency and say, we're in phase one, they will not have any idea what you're talking about. What we tried to do was make these buckets so you can understand where you are, where you can proceed, where you should proceed, what's next. Right? And we kind of blur it out so we all don't get ahead of ourselves. But today we are going to pull back the slide a little bit further so that you can't see what is next. And again, this is a very basic overview. Every step here, you know, has a lot more details, a lot more rules that you should be familiar with. We've gone into them. The slides from the agencies and information from the agencies give you some more guidance on how to do this. But before we jump to the next slide, let's just point out a few things here. For the NSGP, right, the Federal Nonprofit Security Grant Program, which is administered by DHSES, right? They have webinars, video recordings, their slide decks on their website. The link is right there, dhses.ny.gov/nonprofit-programs. If you see within each phase, we kind of give pages of where it is in their slide decks. You'll see if you're in there, there's a part one and a part two in the right year. So make sure you see the right ones that are pertain to you. But we wanted to help zero you in so you can find the information you need, so we don't have to regurgitate every detail, but more the high level stuff as well as the stuff we all want to know. And very, very importantly, keep good records and notes. Every step of this process, your bids, your communication, your meetings internally, keep those records. That's what they're going to want to see. If you've heard any of the agencies say an audit or a fiscal visit, they're going to want to see your notes. So last time we spent a couple sessions on the environmental planning and historical preservation requirements, that EHP, that you must submit to your rep at DHSES, who submits it then to FEMA. And we're now in this waiting period, and we see our stop sign. pretty much, I doubt anyone who's received the most recent NSGP, even if you have submitted your EHP, if you've received the latest 22 NSGP, you probably, to most likely, have not received your approval from FEMA yet. So we have a hard stop there. You can't move forward with procuring vendors. There's certain things, you can do to prepare, but you really, the kicker is you cannot be contracting with vendors. You can't be getting their bids before and everything before this is approved. Plus, you might have changes. So then you're gonna have to go back and change it with your vendor anyways. That's not fun. So let's make sure you get your approval before you take the next step. All right, so let's peel this back. There we go. So for the NSGP, and this will be similar to the hate crimes grant, and we will show you then on the next slide the same flow chart for hate crimes grant, right? We're trying to balance this world. So the overall kicker of identifying vendors, what we're calling the phase 3 for advertisement, are going to be very similar. But we also see we added a new bubble there. Assign a project manager. There, as you've already learned, and if you've been through these grants before, there's a lot to this, right? There was a lot to apply to get these grants, and there's a lot on the back end to actually use the grants, administer them correctly, follow the procurement rules. Having a central cog to navigate through everything will help this be more seamless. I'll give you an example. We see many locations that they went the first 6 months, the year, with someone who was doing the EHP and doing the contract execution, et cetera, and then at some point had to shift and handed it over to someone else who was completely unfamiliar with the program. What happens? First of all, they have no idea about the grant. They don't realize there's budget lines for what they can actually buy and what they can't. They don't realize there's an EHP that dictates where things can be installed and where they can't. So you're almost starting from scratch. So if there is a transition, make sure you do a full transition. But more importantly, because there's all these things, you got to make sure that there's someone kind of overseeing all these steps, even if not in charge of each step per se. So here we are, and this we're going to talk about as we get further into today's session. This is where we are today, the NSGP phase 3 for advertisement. Everyone thinks this can be really quick, right? We put our estimated time, right? How long we think it could take. So you got to write your advertisements. You got to find the paper. You got to navigate with the unresponsive guy who does the advertisement postings in the paper. So you're already 2 weeks in, 3 weeks in. And then you realize that, which we will say a million times, no one actually sees these advertisements. Unfortunately, it's a requirement of the grant, and it makes sense because you have to have a fair and open competitive process. But the reality is, do the sufficient amount of vendors actually see your advertisements? That's somewhere we can help, and we'll talk about it a little bit later. That's somewhere we can help to distribute it to vendors, but you still need to make sure you follow these rules. 3 days in a newspaper, and we're going to look at language, we're going to look at all those things. But again, if you have not advertised, hard stop. You can't go to the next phase, working with your bidders, getting all those pieces in place. This is a requirement, and if the agencies realize that you haven't done it, kind of make you have to start from square one. So here's what we said. We have a very similar process, but different for the hate crimes grant. There's another caveat about looking at our flow chart for the hate crimes grant, right? This is the New York State grant, which is now administered by DCJS. Please refer to our opening session of this series where we really get into each grant and the nuances. But the biggest difference is it's administered by DCJS and not DHSES. DCJS has not provided as much guidance and information as DHSES. So we are providing our guidance. Please, everyone recognize we are providing our guidance based on what DHSES, right, a sister state agency as DCJS, we're providing our best guidance based on what DHSES has provided. Now, recognize though, your contracts from both agencies are very, very, very similar. So we're going to assume, as risky as that may be, we're going to assume that the requirements become the same. That being said, I think personally, this is a Dove Horowitz comment. Personally, I believe DCJS is not as strict as DHSES. So if we follow DHSES rules to the T, you should be in a good place. So that's why another reason why we're going to use DHSES information, but recognize it's a DCJS grant. All right. So now there are slide decks and comments from DHSES where you can get that additional information, but we're in that similar place. The first week we talked about executing your contract, which would be in GMS, Grants Management System, right? And then once you are executed, which was much more confusing because CJS hasn't been responsive. What information do they really need? They didn't even know what they really needed, right? Again, first session, we spoke about this. But if you have your contract executed, and I believe many of you have, you can now get into the advertising stage. You have an additional requirement in this grant, so the hate crimes grant, the New York State hate crimes grant requirement, this is not a requirement of the federal grant, is that you must have 30% of your award allocated to an MWBE, a minority and women-owned business enterprise. All right, again, we're going to talk about that in future sessions, not today, because you can still advertise, and we're going to show some language, how you ensure you say that you're looking for MWBEs, but that is at least under DHSCS, a very, very strict requirement. DCJS sent you their paperwork, so on MWBE, so obviously we know that it is still a high priority requirement. And this is where you should be identifying your vendors. And we're going to talk about this a little bit later as we get through the session. Remember, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. We'll answer them at the end. It's likely your questions will be answered as we proceed. But this is basically where you are. So let's look at the next slide, just to look at both flow charts, right? So here's our two flow charts. These, again, CSI-based flow charts. How we've kind of created buckets of the stages. Your reps will have no idea what you're talking about. If you say phases, they'll know execution, they'll know EHP, they'll know procurement and advertisement, but the phases is our little iteration. But you see, we're kind of in the same next phase here where we need to start identifying vendors, and we're going to use the guidance provided by the state. That being said, before you start getting into the heavy lifting to really starting creating your projects, it's important to have a good project manager and project management plan and program. And with that, before we get into the rest of advertisement, I'm going to turn it over to Ilya to talk you through that and how we advise to navigate the process. Thank you.
Welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining us. Very briefly, and we've talked about it multiple times, at the risk of belaboring this, I want to share with you that imagine that instead of having one doctor giving you all of the advice and leading you through the process of how to get over whatever it is that might be ailing you, you have multiple doctors entering the cabinet, the room, and talk to you for 10 minutes, and each doctor appears to not know what's going on. And each doctor asks you repetitive questions over and over, and nobody seems to give you a good answer. Well, that's how some teams at your peer facilities are feeling when they have to pass certain information along about certain factors of the project when there is no project manager. So if everybody knows incremental bits and pieces of information, but there is no central person who actually looks after your grant within your organization and then interacts with the grant rep, it becomes progressively more difficult as you get through the rest of the stages of or phases of your implementation to manage the different bids, because you don't bid out everything to a single group of vendors. For different types of scopes, you have different types of vendors that you would have to do 3 bids for. And so if the project manager is not looking after these particular 4 categories: scope control, coordination, documentation, and execution, it becomes progressively more challenging. I won't get into too many more details, would rather show you some visuals on the next few slides, but this is where the CSI team is super useful in guiding you if you have any questions. There is a person already at your facility who's a little bit lost, not sure. We understand that a lot of this information is quite dense, and sometimes you are taking over somebody else's role. Somebody is kind of passing it on to you, and now you have to manage this. We are happy to offer you some guidance on what we see, with some of our clientele that are very successful and have managed these projects very well. So to jump through the rest, we've shown this graphic multiple times before, but it's very important to recognize, like Dov was saying, that everything has its own sequence here. And we've tried to organize the steps that you would undertake in the sequence. Now, please, I apologize if it seems like we're now showing you a slightly different looking flow, but it's basically how your procurement process is going to move forward, right? So you've already gotten your grant award, and you will see the check boxes for ease of reference. Step 1, grant award received, contract is signed, EHP is approved. Let's assume that it is, right? Then next comes the preparation of request for proposal. And only after that, once you've put together what it is that you want to do with your projects, then you start advertising, and then you start soliciting through those ads or through other channels, you start soliciting bids. And that's how this flow is going to help you kind of understand that without having put that red checkbox next to the EHP, you can't really move on to the RFP, and you certainly cannot move on with ads and bid process. So just to give you a very brief glimpse of what happens at each stages here, right? So please notice that for the RFP, and we'll talk about it in greater detail, we recommend that your RFP is a set of documents, right? So there should be an RFP cover letter that says, hello, here's what our facility is, give a brief description, and then walk through the steps of your project, telling potential contractors that, hey, don't assume anything. If you are confused about some things, please review the documentation we're going to give you, and please ask us questions. We'll give you more information about these documents. You can ask the CSI team about each of these documents, okay, and help you understand, okay, do you have a template of the RFP letter? Yes, we do. We can share that with you. Do you have a template of the general requirements for contractors? Yes, we do. We can give you that as well. What is that photo with the building with a couple of annotations? Well, that's part of your EHP, because EHP is, and it should be, forming part of your RFP, the request for proposal, because EHP is the visual tour around your facility for contractors to understand what it is that you want to implement. Then you move on, and Dov will cover the ad process and then the bid process. And we have various types of documents that could be very helpful for your teams as you move on with this process. Obviously, we're not going to go through each and every document that we're showing here, but this is a set of documents that you should have in order to pass it on to the bidders as a request for proposal. So for those of you who are not familiar with the acronym RFP, it's request for proposal. You'll have your cover letter, which we have a template of, and we can share that with you and walk you through how that works and what it should state. But pretty much it's kind of self-explanatory. We've written it up for you so that you can just adjust it for your facility, for dates that you want, and so on. And there's a bit of guidance there. Your EHP, you will be preparing, and we've had a session on EHP. If you want, log into our playlist on the JCRC's Consultants Corner website, and you can review previous sessions where we talk about EHP and how it's put together. And there's guidance from Dishes, and we've added some of our commentary. Then there's instructions to bidders. Now, for the longest time, yours truly has been trying to write, a general specification. What we found was that, yes, for certain types of facilities who have a fairly good project management process and a very good, I suppose, understanding of how to run those projects, a general specification, which is a very thick volume of requirements, is a useful tool. However, for a lot of facilities, many, many more facilities than those few that have this understanding, we need to condense it into something that's really understandable, both for the team that's going to manage the project, as well as for the bidders. And we have condensed the most important requirements for the bidders to follow. So you'll see that under this box, instructions to bidders, you'll see the general description, what kind of facility the bidders are going to be dealing with, what is the general security scope, the contact details for the key person at the facility, hopefully your project manager, and then general requirements for contractors. Okay. And There could be a couple of refinements there that we will make, and we can make this available to you. But this is something that we feel most contractors, if not all, need to follow in order to deliver better quality of a project or overall better delivery of a project to you. Obviously, because all of these are recorded, we don't expect you to remember every bit that we say here. You can always go back to the recording, stop this, and then take a screenshot or take a photo of this, or just kind of stop the video and just take some notes as to what it is that you're looking at. But just to run through quickly, right? As I said, and Dov started with that same statement, it is a certainty that if you don't have a project manager, it's going to be far more challenging and likely less cohesive for you to run the projects, whatever they may be, video surveillance implementation, hiring a security guarding firm, whatever that may be, hardening your doors. If there is no project manager, we don't see how those projects can get accomplished, not only efficiently, but also with the good degree of success. And this is where we always caution our clients that there are two states of security. One is real security that actually works, and it can be tested and it performs at the level that a security practitioner could accept. And then there is such a thing as security theater, where you may have completed a project. You may think that everything that you implemented works, but when a security practitioner arrives, they actually see nothing but gaps. And the quality of implementation is less than desirable. And the performance of all sorts of controls that you've implemented is actually not there. For example, we've seen many times where a man trap is implemented and it's turned off, doesn't work, and the facility doesn't want it to work a month after implementation. Money spent, but security control not used. Same for video, same for intrusion detection systems, and many other controls. So a project manager is a very important piece of your puzzle. As I said before, there's a process of isolating scopes of work. And because there are multiple trades, if you will, among the bidders that do certain types of things, but not everything. So for example, door hardware is a niche market that only certain bidders work in. So you shouldn't expect that a video surveillance company that installs cameras would be able to do door hardware for you. Much the same way that a door hardware contractor may not be able and capable of installing video surveillance. So you'll have to isolate those scopes. We can give you some guidance on that and how it's done in order to maximize your success and also find the right bidders. Like I said, there's this list of door hardware, window film, electronic systems, guards, training, and so on and so forth. And for all of those, you'll have to understand for what type of scope you need to get 3 bidders. Creating a project schedule, and we'll show you what that might look like, for each isolated scope is very important. So needless to say, because now it gets a little bit more complicated. You may be running, let's say, more than one project at the same time. And so you have to make sure that you have enough bandwidth to run different types of contractors with different commitments, with different schedules and different types of hardware and workload at your site. And sometimes there are coordination issues, right? For example, why would you install access control on a door that you're replacing? Okay, so that's something that a lot of facilities are struggling with. Create a project schedule for each isolated scope. We'll show you how that works. Engage with manufacturers and not vendors to learn more about products and get pricing. So I've said it before, manufacturers are an amazing resource when you are looking to understand how things work. So for example, if you want to know more about how a 3-megapixel camera is different from an 8-megapixel camera, a manufacturer of such cameras could be very useful to you without bias to demonstrate what the difference is between different models of their product. And you could do that with different camera manufacturers. There's luckily a plethora of those. And the same goes for all sorts of other equipment. Manufacturers also have their own engineers that can help you answer some of the more technical questions that you may not have capability to answer on your own. But again, CSI team is in place to help you if you're struggling with some of those relationships, with understanding where to go.
And Ilya,
Then, David.
Just very quickly, CSI subscribes to a service called IPVM, which is essentially the Consumer Reports of the security industry. And they run comparison tests between cameras and access control systems and other things. And as you're starting to think through the process, you can ask us to supply you with what they call a shootout, the information comparing the various manufacturers. So that's another service we can provide.
Again, that service, I must say, and David, thank you for bringing that up. Even some security consultants who have years in the industry don't know about this service. Okay, so this is something that's really bespoke and very well researched in the security industry. It's one of those very few service platforms that helps you understand which brand, even though both brands, let's say, or 5 or 6 brands may be, on the surface similar, but actually where there are some pitfalls and what to look out for. They provide a very deep technological research that is then very easily digested for common understanding. So they use less technical language and they basically try to give you an interpretation so that it's more easy to understand.
There are certain manufacturers and suppliers who deal in what's called in the trade hostageware. In other words, if you don't continue to pay the monthly fee, your camera system turns into a brick and it's totally unusable. It's not that you don't get extra features, you get nothing. So, we can help guide you about which manufacturers do follow those practices.
And another thing, David, just staying on the subject for a second, is that IPVM is also very good at looking at technical nuances of which particular camera models and brands or security technology models and brands are banned by the US government. Manufacturer might say, not all of our cameras are banned. So, they might provide a superficial list, but IPVM actually goes and looks more deeply at each of those seemingly approved camera models, and then they find that actually there is some equipment components inside those cameras that are not approved. They deliver that information as well. Because if you install a camera that a manufacturer says, yes, it's not banned by US government, right? But if a component in that camera happens to be banned, then you will not get funding for that equipment.
What happens, some people are relabeling equipment. Bill was on with us, Bill Hayes, our Westchester Bronx person, went into a facility and found the cameras were labeled in one place, with X brand, which most people would think is an American brand, but they were actually one of the banned products.
Correct. And there was a company on Long Island not so long ago that was selling a similar type of equipment to US government. And until the government actually found out that they were reselling and relabeling banned equipment. Guess how many government facilities are now scratching their heads and saying, well, what do? We got to, replace all those systems. But yeah, unfortunately, this still happened. Again, the CSI team is a very good resource for you if you have questions. And I understand that some of these things can be very detailed. To the extent that you want to seek that guidance, please just reach out to your regional security manager. And last but not least, just prepare the RFP cover letter. Again, we have a template for that. We can share, create a list of potential bidders to pre-qualify. So that we'll go over in a few more details. Now, this is scope isolation. Okay, so for example, you can start with how you're going to be bidding out your doors. What is your budget, right? When did you place the ad? If you have been already approved and your EHP has been approved and you've identified, that here is my documents, here is my RFP, here is what I'm going to send out for my doors, when the ad is placed, and how a project manager basically would manage each of the milestones for implementation of the door scope. Then there's video access, intrusion detection, film, for window film, guarding, training, and so on and so forth, depending on what types of scope you will be responsible for. This is where it requires management, attention to detail, and a fairly broad spectrum of information that is available to a project manager, and obviously a few decision makers that this project manager interacts with. Okay, this is probably one of the better ways to run this. If you make this information incremental, so for example, horizontal line, scope, sequence, budget are with person A, ads placement is with person B, then RFP release with person C. It all becomes very, very messy very quickly. And then, unfortunately, people are pointing fingers at each other. Well, you didn't do this, I forgot that. And it just becomes a hot mess. Very difficult to unravel and rebalance and make sure that the rest of the project will run smoothly. So ask us questions if you are about to begin this journey. This is what a project schedule may look like. Bid process may take, let's say, 1 to 3 weeks. I would strongly recommend that you treat bidders kindly as well. Because sometimes when we tell them, yeah, you got to reply to me within a week, they have maybe 20 to 30 bids that they got to put out, right? The more quickly you're asking them to reply, the less quality you should expect back. If you give them at least a 2-week time to analyze your scope, maybe ask some follow-up questions, and then come back to you, that would give them a little bit more breathing room and therefore ensure better quality of the proposal. So then there's mobilization once you've awarded, there is exterior work, interior work, handover. So you can see how you can put different blocks of the project, and that requires its own management. And some of them could run for 2 weeks, but unfortunately, you've seen how things have been delayed in the pandemic. Mobilization alone can take up to 4 or 5 weeks, right? It depends on what time access could be allowed at the site. Maybe the site is so busy that you can only allow increments of a day to be available for some work. So again, that's something that a project manager together with some decision makers can work on. I said that engagement with manufacturers before you start advertising your project, before you've completed and prepared your request for proposal documentation, is very useful, because guess how bidders return proposals to you? They will probably mention something like J3487D5, which to most of us makes 0 sense, but it is a model number. So then you ask a question, well, what's this for? And then you spend hours and hours back and forth. Well, this number doesn't make any sense to me. I don't understand what you're referring to. And there could be a list of such numbers. What's useful is to kind of level the playing field and learn from manufacturers about the types of products that you're looking to implement. Manufacturers kindly offer all of this training for free. Okay, so no obligation. You can say that, yeah, we're considering your products for a project. No obligations, because manufacturers do not install, so they're not going to be your bidders. You can ask them for that level of assistance. Then very briefly about bidder pre-qualification. So what happened just not so long ago, I was actually helping another Jewish facility to prepare and then run a project. One of the bidders that we were entertaining for the RFP, we were doing some follow-up. The ads went out, but before that, we actually looked at potential bidders who could actually participate on a project. When we went on social media, there were a bunch of comments about that particular company. First of all, subbing out most of the work, about 90%. And then their subcontractors complaining that they don't get paid on time. One of the clients of this contractor complained about the quality of work on site. You have that information available if you know where to look. There's also quite a bit of historic knowledge. Even though CSI does not recommend bidders, we certainly have a significant data bank of information about past projects, how they went, who's done the work. And of course, you can also reach out to your peers in the community, other facilities that may have done these projects, and try to understand how trustworthy this particular contractor is. And we've seen, unfortunately, that a contractor who has no business installing anything in the security technology field, they might be, let's say, a door contractor, right? They also claim to do everything else. And unfortunately, clients don't know where to look to identify whether they actually are capable, whether that contractor is capable of doing the work. And they fall prey to contractors who are not scrupulous. They actually maybe subcontract most of that work, which costs you. The moment the work is subcontracted, right, you're paying premium rates because the contractor that's selling you the project is marking up the price from a subcontractor. Okay. And there could be sometimes 3 or 4 companies down the line that are doing the work, and you'd never know it. And unfortunately, the more companies that are subcontractors, the less quality control you'll have. And unfortunately, the overall quality of the project suffers, because then there's a lot of finger pointing. Bidder pre-qualification, and these points particularly, are very important. I used to work on the United Nations project in New York City. I believe at least 2 electrical contractors went bankrupt during that project, just simply because they weren't able to manage their liquidity. How do you think that works for an ongoing project where you already awarded the work for a big job that has its own schedule, dates, expectations, and what have you, right? 2 electrical contractors to say, we can't work on it anymore, we're broke. You wouldn't want a company that's in dire straits to supply work to you. So again, be careful. As promised, this is something that we've prepared. We'll share that with you. This is a very good general set of requirements for contractors. Read it at your leisure. Take a look at it. Some of the things may be a little bit more technical. Ask us questions. We're happy to share and answer them. I can tell you from my personal experience, if I run a project where I say to contractors, as part of your contract, as we sign, you will commit that you will follow these rules. For sure, the project will be delivered with better quality and better attention, because there are some covenants here that require commitment of professional behavior from the contractors and set certain baseline rules for the quality of equipment they give you, that the quality of work will be maintained, and so on and so forth. That's something that we can share with you easily, so you can include it in your RFP packages. I'm passing it back to you, Dov, to cover ads.
Before I jump back in, having a little bit of internet issues, so if I cut out, I'm going to ask David to tag in for me. But just to reiterate on those pieces that Ilya just shared with you, right? There's obviously what is requirement of your contract, and then there's what it takes to actually do a good project. And what we've shared is our experience, information that can really help you take this to a high level, do it efficiently, and almost more importantly, effectively. You are required to have an RFP, right? You're making an advertisement, which we're about to jump into. What are you sharing with your bidders, with your potential bidders? And that's where Ilya shared with you. A lot of the information will be available. Obviously, these slides are recorded and put on our website. You'll have this information to help build your package. Now, we're not going to use the Consultants Corner to go through every detail of the advertisement or procurement requirements, right? Please refer to the DHSCS slides. There's one here, right? We mentioned in the beginning that your ad has to be up for 3 days. If it's a weekly, everyone always asks this, if it's a weekly, it says right here in the DHSCS slides that a weekly will cover your 3-day requirement. I get people, or our team gets people who like to argue with us. It's not our rule. They see little nuances in the language. It says they should do 3 days. It doesn't say required, but then you also see 3-day requirement in the language. Just bear with us. It's got to be 3 days. DHSCS will answer you. If you ask them, it has to be 3 days. Obviously, a week covers 3 days. So one week publication. Now, again, let's reiterate some of the important key points that we want to make sure to share with you, because we see the mistakes there, and just to reiterate it. Well, first of all, there is DHSCS language. It's pretty basic. Again, the requirement, and we're going to look at that at the next slide, the requirement is to make the ad. Okay, so people get spun up in all the nuances and details. The requirement is that the ad is in a paper, it gets you, and it's how you solicit your bids. All right, use their basic language, don't over worry about it. Obviously, some timeline things you need to think about realistically, but some people get a little spun up on this piece. The requirement is that you have the ad. There's no one's going to judge it or critique every little word you use. But note the link on top. Again, this is back to that DHSCS nonprofit page. So if you have that from earlier, part 2, pages 8 to 14, please refer to that, right? So right now we're looking at the little square right here. The little image is page 13 of this year's NSGP training. Again, we can use that similar information for how you're going to do a hate crimes advertisement, because you are required by your contract to advertise for your bids. Make sure it's an appropriate paper. Can't be a religious paper. It can't be a specific language. It should cover your general area. It doesn't have to be the New York Times. It doesn't even have to be the New York Post. People use Cranes or AM New York, Brooklyn Eagle. Someone's asking me Hamodia on the chat. Usually we don't answer the chat correctly. 100% not. Hamodia is a religious periodical. It's exactly what you cannot publicize your advertisement in. It has to be a local. Think about it, that you and your neighbor, whatever language you speak, whatever religion, that everyone gets it evenly. If you're having trouble identifying a paper, reach out to your regional security director. The good, easy ones, AM New York, Cranes, like we said, Brooklyn Eagle in Brooklyn. There's other one, I think there's an R Town in Manhattan. These aren't referrals. These are just some options that you can get the requirement. So now with me, everybody, we're at the third bullet. The ad must be posted for, I think everyone said 3 days. 3 days. Please, a minimum of 3 days. That is a requirement. Now, what's going to happen is you're going to get into the procurement process. And this is what Ilya was sharing with you about what do you share with the ad? So now you made your ad and they respond back to you. They have to respond to this ad, and you should be providing materials till your ad is posted, right? That's why we had that stop sign in the beginning. For those of you who joined later, please refer to the beginning of the session and to previous sessions we're building every week to recognize that the ad has to happen before you talk to any of your bidders. Manufacturers is different, what Ilya was talking about. That's to know the products that are out there and what they can do for you. So wait till they respond to your ad. Otherwise, it's preferential treatment. It happens. If for some reason you have a previous bidder, or maybe you've had projects done before, so you post your ad and you share with that company, hey, we're advertising for another project. That's actually the most legit way to do it, right? So they probably know you have a grant, there's more project, but they need to respond, and you need to get something we'll talk about in future sessions, 3 bids for every budget line, all right? So just remember that. Now, there are some other nuances that you'll read about in the advertisement basics, right? That really putting in a paper, soliciting written bids, is only over certain funding levels. Keep your lives simple. We're splitting hairs over minimal dollars. Most of your budgets are going to be over 10 grand. You have to do the full open, fair, competitive bidding process, which is what we're describing. We don't even talk about the other ways because it's just going to confuse you. You're making an ad anyways, most likely. I doubt you broke up your $150,000 award into under 10,000 pieces. So stick with us. Keep it simple for yourself. Don't try to go Talmudic on us. It's tempting. It won't really save much. So get that paper, get your advertisement in the paper, solicit your sealed bids, meaning you don't review them until you're with committee, something we're going to keep talking about. This is page 12 of this year's DHSES presentation for the NSGP. So you can have that information there. Everyone still comes to us. We take it from them. We have not rewritten this. Obviously, read through the language, tweak it to you. You might not be doing, if you see in the third line, it references a camera surveillance system, right? You may not be doing that. Change the language to the projects you're doing so you get the right responses. Even if we were to share your ad, we can't refer, but we can share your ad to our own networks. You don't know if it came from us or your advertisement, right? We can't refer, but if I say, hey, they're looking for ballers, and it doesn't say that in their advertisement, the person looking at it isn't even going to want to move forward. So obviously list your projects. These are just things we see. List a generic email. This is what the state advises, right? You've been identified as having a threat. Why would you put it out on the paper? Who your location is? So make it anonymous. Who you are, then this is how everyone will solicit their bids. And you got to think of reasonable amount of times is the last line. I'm not going to read through every word here. Obviously, go to the DHSES slides. How much time does it take to make sure people have these bids? You solicit enough to get 3 for every project. That's a requirement. 3 bids for every project every year. DHSES says it's a problem. You need to get those 3 bids. So if you only get 1 response, 2 responses, or maybe someone even visits your location for a walkthrough and then doesn't follow up with the bid, you still need to get a bid. So you'll have to go again and share your advertisement with some additional vendors. This process is lengthy, like Ilya was just sharing with you. Then they need to prepare their bid. They have other clients. They have other questions. This stuff takes time. Don't try to rush it. This is why this is a 3-year grant period. It's going to give yourself personally the time and your vendors the time and the real world application. I promised that we would share also the state's language, what to add in about when you have an MWBE requirement. Again, this information is provided by the state. Granted, it's from DHSES information. And if you have a new hate crimes grant, it's DCJS. But they set the stage for us. Why would we make it more confusing? You have to make an advertisement. You have to do the procurement process. So let's make sure we include this language, basically that you MWE vendors are preferred, being seeked, however appropriate language you want to include. Sorry, it'll be in a future session. We're going to talk about the bid matrix, David. Apologies. Obviously, Ilya and I always got to make sure that the slides work for everybody. Let's just go through this summary real quick. And if David, you want to add a little bit on that before we do go forward, but just real quick.
You have to start thinking about how you make your decision, because you have to basically publish that. People might be looking at it. One question I got last week was, well, we don't want someone to come in and say we have to rip out everything, all of our existing equipment, and they'll install all new equipment, so that you can come up with a requirement that your decision will be made based on compatibility with existing equipment. And you can weight your decision based on someone who can come in and say, oh, we're going to add on to your current system, not rip it off. That's something to think about. If you have questions, come to us and ask.
We're assuming, obviously, many people have, thank you, David. Many people are still in the waiting period for the EHP approval. I saw some people wrote they already have received it. That's great. So you could move forward to the next stage. Ideally, you should be making your scoring criteria. So when you get your 3 bids, this is a next week topic, but when you get your bids with a committee of a couple people, right? A fair competitive process, one person can't make this decision. You make a committee. You want to have a scoring matrix about the criteria, how you're evaluating your bidders. We're going to get into that next week. So let's just go through this real quick so we can get to questions. Obviously, like we referenced today, review the material from DHSCS and DCJS and make sure you're familiar with it. You read the material, we reference it, sign a project manager. That's what Ilya was talking about today. And then make sure you're following your contractual obligations. We don't go through every detail. We try to fill in the blanks when it's confusing. Ensure your contract's executed. We talked about that in week 1. For the NSGP, ensure your EHP is approved, right? We spent a lot of time on that, did some live sessions. For projects over 10K, which is most projects, you need to advertise and have a sealed bidding process. That was kind of we got into today. The hate crimes grant requires 30% to a minority and women-owned business enterprise. That's going to talk about in the next few sessions. Document your efforts. I literally saw an email this morning saying, hey, the state is saying we didn't do the process well enough. We didn't have enough notes. We need to start the whole MWB process over again. So from the front end, the first time you touch anything, just screenshot, take notes, write it down, etc. The 3 bids for any budget levels we started getting into next session. We mentioned the evaluate bids by committee with the predetermined scoring criteria in the next session. And don't contact the vendors until advertised. That's wherever you are in the process. That's not the next session, it's not the last session. That's based on where you are in the process. That's always. And always keep your notes, documents, and records.
And let me just jump in and give one example. So I know personally of examples where vendors sued both the client and other vendors when they felt like they were treated unfairly, particularly if one of the vendors, as they found out, was being coordinated with prior to the advertisement. So that means that there's preferential treatment. There were lawsuits filed by huge New York companies against their peers and against the client, who invited them to the bid, but then treated them less fairly than they treated a particular vendor. Possibly that they wanted to actually do a project with, but they needed a competitive bid. Don't think that this is all trivial. Okay, even smaller companies that take on projects within our community, they could be quite aggressive in the way that, you have your own expectations, but they have their own expectations. They're not treated fairly. Not only will you lose a good partner going forward, but you might also get yourself into trouble.
Perfect. Well said. And we'll use that as a segue to the next slide. We have some common FAQs. And I mentioned already, and Bill, as soon as we're through these 4 or 5 questions, we'll jump to the chat. But everyone asks, can you refer vendors? Who can we use? Can we have a contact? We can't. We're a nonprofit. We would like to stay unaffiliated. And to what Ilya was just saying, if we're in the middle and we have good relationships and we're bringing the vendors in, they spend making a bid for you takes a lot of time. And if they realize they're just being jerked around, that's going to hurt our relationship. It's going to hurt your relationship. The vendors we work with know we keep it even. We're helping locations through the procurement process, but we're not involved with the actual bidding. The vendors they select, we stay out of it. And we ask that you respect that process as well. It doesn't mean you can't use a vendor just once you advertise, share it with them. And to keep the process kosher, but we cannot refer vendors. What we can do, as soon as you post your ad in a paper or wherever, you can take that ad and share it. I see the last question in the chat. As soon as it's posted, you can share it around the world. You can put it on social media. You can put it on your website, even though that's not good OPSEC, right? Operational security. It defeats the whole anonymous piece. But I'm just saying, you can share your ad once it's posted, as long, obviously, that advertisement itself needs to be up 3 days. But as soon as your advertisement is posted, you can share it. And then everyone should respond to that anonymous email you created, so you ensure you follow the procurement process. When you have that image of the actual ad, share it with your regional security director, who will work with Ilya and myself to distribute it to vendors that we know are right for your location, for the size of your project, etc. All those different variables, because we're not here to waste anyone's time, but we want to make sure you do get those bidders, because unlikely many will see the advertisement. So both you, through Google searching, contacting your neighbors who they use, whatever way you find additional vendors, you can share your ad and share it with us as well when you're ready. But make sure it's the ad, not like your Word document, because that doesn't prove to us that you actually advertised it. All right, we touched on this and we got a million questions. We're not going to go deep in MWBE, but basically, if you have a $50,000 award, MWBE is a requirement for your hate crimes grant. So those are $50,000 awards. You are required to spend 30% on minority and women-owned business enterprises. It's hard. How do you split hairs to get to the right vendor? Maybe find vendors that can do the whole project, the whole 50 grand. We're working hard behind the scenes to find appropriate vendors who can do this work. They have to be by the state. They have to have the right codes and certifications to do not only security, but these exact projects. It's very, very specific, very tight. There's not a ton of vendors, and there's definitely not a lot of responsive vendors. So please, again, work with your RSD as you navigate this process so we can help you find these vendors. Obviously, the grant's been around for a few years. People have been successful, but it's a tough slog, and we're here to go through it with you to find those vendors. And a common question we always get, and in the future session, we'll talk about modifications, or more importantly, what's called investment justification modifications. If you make a change to your building, or you add some security items, or you change the project, there is the mechanism to work with your rep at the state to update your award, move the grant funds around as needed, and make an IJ modification. If there's been changes to your buildings, then you will need to do an EHP modification and then go back into the same process, same type of documentation, sending it to the state, who sends it to FEMA, and you wait for approval. So yeah, you can do that if something had to happen, you're renovating the lobby, you're still waiting for your grant funds, so you're going to have to go back if you haven't implemented your grant yet and get those changes and approvals taken care of. I mean, I wrote these questions and it still makes me laugh. This is a very, very common question, and it's the truth. It's very hard to get 3 bidders. Please slog through, work with us, keep distributing, do your research. You need 3 bidders for every project, meaning, and again, we're going to talk about this more next week, or not next week, the next session, which is first Tuesday of February. Please note, it's 3 weeks from now. Do really, really have to get 3 bids. Yes, yes, yes. Every project. Your camera project, 3 bids. Your access control project, 3 bids. Your door project, 3 bids. It could be the same vendor if they do those projects. They need to submit that bid for that item so that you can clearly say you have those 3 bids. That's what we're here for. We're here to help you navigate both the procurement, the grant rules. That's what our team's here for, as well as the actual security design. We want you to use these funds the most effectively as you can, not get taken by a vendor. There are great vendors out there that won't, but you never know, especially the ones who are trying to usurp up all these government grants, and everyone's getting stressed because there's so much information. Take your time, assign that project manager, go through the details step by step. If you're trying to do it by tomorrow, yeah, in a month, you're going to rush, you're going to make mistakes. But if you recognize this is a long-term project, and to do it right, we got to do the right steps, both contractually and security program-wise, you'll be in a good place. But that's what we're here for. Reach out to your regional security directors. They have all this information we've shared. They can help you through the gray area. We can potentially set up one-on-one calls here and there as needed. But this is definitely your starting point. These webinars trying to really close a lot of the gaps.
Let me jump in for just 1 second. So especially on this last bullet, it's super important to be mindful of one interesting thing that we're noticing in the community among the clients that are a little bit more advanced than most of you, and they're already trying to award their projects, or select the bidders and get the projects implemented, right? So I was recently working with a client who has 2 bids for video surveillance. 1 bid, and the count of video surveillance cameras is, relatively, it's the same, and both bidders are bidding for the same number of video surveillance cameras. 1 bid comes out to $40,000, another one comes out to $29,000. So my client says, "This is amazing. I just, look how much lower the other bid is. This is wonderful. So I'm going to award to the $29,000 bidder. That's it, and it's right within my budget. Fantastic." I said, "Can we take a moment?" And so I said, let's take a look at what they're actually bidding. And we started looking at the line items of the technology that they were proposing. And lo and behold, they bid security cameras, they bid security cabling for the cameras, they bid some licenses for the cameras, but they forgot the recording equipment. So my client is none the wiser because they don't know whether that line item should be there or not. They just say, "I want the thing to work." But the bidder and their engineer didn't do good enough homework, didn't do good enough design to actually include the item that's probably the costliest. And then I said, let's take a look at the other bidder who's at $41,000. And I said, look, they're including all of the equipment. So this system will work without any changes and without any additional requests for money. And the $29,000 system will not. But unfortunately, the community, and we completely understand this, is not prepared to look at these proposals line item by line item. And unfortunately, some of the bidders don't even provide line items. They just say, "I'm going to sell you a video surveillance system for $29,000. And they don't explain what's included. And then they forget, "Oh, but wait, I'm about done with the project, but you need to pay me $5,000 more because I forgot this and that," right? And so you're like, wait a second, yeah, it's a turnkey system. Why are you asking for more money? So this headache, we want you to avoid it at all costs. That's why Dov is bringing up this point of talking to us. Ask us, and we will try to help you.
With that, I know we're a few minutes over time. We always do. We have a lot of fun here. But if you're still with us, take us through a few of the questions. I know there's a few in there. I think we answered some as we went.
One that's coming up regularly is where's all this? You put a lot of material out there, templates and so on and so forth. Where are we going to make that available? On the website?
The webinars are all recorded and posted within a few days. That will be on our Consultants Corner website. Some of the additional information, right, like the RFP page and potentially, some of the other stuff we've put together, we will have on our soon-to-be developed webpage on procurement in general. So it will be shared. And if you need it sooner, please reach out to your RSD, but this stuff will all be on the website shortly.
In regards to advertising, is a public Jewish newspaper such as Hamodia appropriate? And I know this has come up before, local versus niche versus national.
Definitely not to a specific religious paper or specific language. It's straight out of the DHSCS guidance. National would cover your requirements. Local and very micro-local will cover your requirements as long as it's evenly distributed. Right? It could be a Brooklyn only paper or potentially even your neighborhood, but if neighborhood based on geography, not neighborhood based on religion or specific population like that. So as long as it has that even distribution to an area and is legitimate advertising.
There's a prohibition against special interest groups, and you shouldn't get into a debate whether Hamodia has a special interest audience or not. The Brooklyn Eagle has a general audience, as an example.
How many attempts to get MWE bids is enough to get a waiver on that for the hate crimes grant?
We're going to get into more MWE in the following weeks. If you have a recent one, we're hoping DCJS is not as strict as DHSES. In more recent years, DHSES didn't even want to do a waiver at all. And I've worked with locations. We got to go back to the drawing board. So there's no number of attempts. It's that you've documented a thorough research. There's a website that your reps probably hopefully shared with you that we'll talk about in future sessions, where you find the state approved MWBs, right? There's also local MWBs, federal. We need New York State, Empire State Development approved MWBEs with the right commodity codes. We're getting into the weeds here for a future session with the right commodity codes for your project. So you might find someone who can do cameras, but they're not approved for lighting per se. Again, we don't know where DCJS is going to be on this interpretation, but no matter what you do, when you get into that ESD website, start screenshotting. There's all these different codes. Just do more than you think necessary. Screenshot every search you do. Okay, and then you identified 10 vendors that are potential, and then you wrote an email and you documented that you emailed all of them and that no one wrote back, and you emailed them again and no one wrote back. And the more effort you show and you document, that's going to be the kicker. If the state doesn't feel you have clear documentation, they're not going to work on the waiver. However, what we just said is based on DHSCS's approach to MWBE. We're still learning with DCJS.
And with regards to ad, does it have to be a print ad, or is an ad on an online site like Brooklyn Brownstone sufficient? That's
a good question. I don't personally have the answer to that one. We've always advised to stick with a publication, how DHSCS explains it. Usually it's also replicated in an online paper. I know locations have used that when it's a legitimate distributed online paper and they have that PDF feature versus just a blog. So there are like nuances that I think are beyond what we can decipher on this call, on this conversation. But I think if they have that legitimate publication, right, it's not just a blog or postings, but it's a publication they do on a regular, weekly, every day, whatever it is, then you have a publication. To get around that gray area, just stick with the paper that we know is in print. That is my best advice. David, you want to add anything on that one?
The only thing to add on that is the New York State Contract Reporter, and I can post the web address, but you can post into the official list of state contracts, put your ad there, and that will count. If you're looking, especially for MWBE, the question isn't how many bids you get. The question is, what kind of outreach did you do? Did you go to the Empire State Development website, get a list of other firms with the commodity codes that are applicable to your contract, email to each one of your RFP to each one of these firms? If you did that and you didn't get any results, then you can go and ask for a waiver, but they're still tough. But at least you can document that you did outreach to everyone who was appropriate.
It's in the documentation and following the process. So actually, again, I'm going to refer you back to DHSCS's slides. They point you step by step how to go through the ESD website and this MWBE portal and how to select and how to find and what to screenshot. So definitely refer to that as you start getting into the MWBE world. We have not touched it fully in depth on these webinars yet.
Follow up to your questions from the presentation. The question you raised was, can bidders interact directly with vendors? You did respond to that question, but as a follow-up, if nobody responds to your ad, can you then reach out to vendors? Can you email the image of the ad to vendors directly that you want to deal with or have previously met? Is the gist of the question.
Great question. And let's say this, please note, you will most likely not get any responses to your advertisement. It's been our experience. We tell people, they forget, they come back, no one responded. That's just the reality. That's why we want to help ensure distributing your advertisement. What you 100% should do without us is, once it's advertised, once you follow those rules and put it in a publication that meets the criteria, share it with vendors, do research, talk to people, get referrals, and then say, hey, here's our advertisement. Take that snippet, take that image, share it with potential vendors. Hey, we're looking for vendors. Please see our advertisement. If they respond, you share your RFP as Ilya started getting into, your request for proposal, and then you get the machinery working. But 100%, once it's posted, you can share it to everybody in the world. But just the kicker from what we're trying to convey is that you're required to have that advertisement. Until then, anything before that could potentially risk your reimbursement. Once you have the advertisement posted kosher, get it out there, because you're going to have to be aggressive. No one's going to actually just respond. If you sit and wait, you're not going to catch any fish.
I think that's all I have.
Great questions, a lot of information. I see we have a lot of details to get into in future webinars, but definitely in the interim, everybody, please refer to the information that's provided by the state agencies. With that, our next session is February 7th, that Tuesday, February 7th, right? It's the first and third Tuesday of every month. So we have a little bonus week in there. Thank you, everybody. See you next time. Good luck. Be in touch with your RSDs and your state reps.